Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals Podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Animal Training Fundamentals with Barbara Heidenreich. I've got another special guest for you, someone that I can't believe we haven't actually met in person because it seems like we know all the same people and we kind of run in the same circles. And when we got to talking, it kind of felt like I was talking with a best friend that I've known for years. So I'm super excited to bring her to you, at least over a podcast. And I hope you get a chance to run into her in person or meet her at a conference down the road, because she's got lots of great information to share. And be sure to check out the episode webpage after you listen to the podcast, because we've got some great resources for you that this special guest has worked on over the years that I think you're going to find invaluable. So let's not wait any longer. Let's get into this interview. Well, hello, everybody. It's Barbara Heidenreich, and I have another special guest with me. It's Dr. Erica Feuerbacher, and she is a behavior analyst and a professor of companion animal behavior and welfare at the Department of Animal and Poultry Science at Virginia Tech. So I'm going to just say Dr. Erica because I think that's a little bit easier. So welcome, Dr. Erica.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a mouthful otherwise, so that's a great way to go.
Well, I'm really excited. A lot of the guests that I've had lately have challenging last names, and as I do as well. And I think that's going to be our mission in life, is that people have to learn how to say our last names.
Right, exactly.
We'll become infamous for our challenging last names.
Right, we stand out. So that's good.
There's been other famous challenging last names out there that people have learned how to say. So why not ours, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, first of all, you have to tell us about your background, because I haven't told anybody yet what it is that you do, other than, a behavior analyst and a researcher. But, well, let's start there, actually. Let's start there first, and then we'll get into your background. Tell us exactly what it is that you do as a behavior analyst and a professor of companion animal behavior and welfare. That's a mouthful. What does it mean? What does that mean that you do?
It is. Yeah. So at Virginia Tech, I'm in, as you mentioned, Department of Animal and Poultry Sciences. So I have a kind of a joint appointment, well, not joint, but a split appointment where I have some teaching that I do. So I teach in our companion animal emphasis, and then we started a new applied animal behavior and welfare masters that I teach in. Then I have extension work. So that's where we're partnering with community members and shelters and other folks that need sort of behavior resources in our community. And even though I don't have a research appointment per se, the extension really is applied research, where we're going out to shelters and studying how to improve shelter dog welfare. We're working with owners looking at how can we better train dogs and use more humane and effective methods. And so my extension and research kind of get rolled together. I do practice as an applied animal behaviorist, so we'll see cases. I'm at the moment sort of overwhelmed with teaching and other duties at school, so I don't see as many of those as I would like, but hopefully in the future we'll get back to seeing more private cases as well.
But you've also done quite a bit of research, actually, in Dr. Clive Wynn's lab, as I look at your incredible curriculum vitae.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things, and part of the reason, actually one of the main reasons I went into this was I was training my German Shepherd. She was the first dog I had on my own. She was a working line Shepherd, so she's quite a challenge. And I just really loved training and really loved behavior. And the more I trained her, the more questions I had. And then, I found the field of behavior analysis, and they could answer a lot of them. But there's so much more to do, especially applying those principles to our companion animals and seeing how do they actually work, and how can we improve those, and how can we improve our relationships with our animals through that. So yeah, the research to me is one of my favorite parts of trying to figure out how can we improve our relationships with our animals.
So how did you get into this whole industry and this whole field? What brought you down this pathway?
Yeah, I have kind of a curved kind of approach to this, which I always hope is inspiring to other people that don't have that direct line of saying, I know what I'm going to do. I, like probably both of us, grew up just loving animals and surrounding myself with as many animals as my parents would let me, which in retrospect was a lot. They were very generous. So I had pygmy goats and chickens and pigeons and rabbits and cats and dogs and horses. And it was great. It was really fun. And I just loved my animals and just found them fascinating. So I went to school at Arizona State for my undergraduate, and I ended up majoring in biology because it was sort of animal oriented. So I did a lot of zoology and started doing research in a honeybee lab, which was really great. I like the honeybees. And so from there, I had a really successful undergraduate research project. And, I considered vet school, but I didn't think it was for me. And at that point, when you said I want to work with companion animals, that was kind of the only option people put forward. And so that's where I kind of was like, well, I like the environment and ecology as well. And so headed off there. And my bee research was really kind of looking at their behavior too, comparing pollen and nectar foragers. And so it was successful, and sort of without thinking as much as I should, I went off to graduate school in insect physiology at Berkeley. And it is a really interesting field, and I'm still fascinated by it, but it wasn't my passion. So at the same time, when I graduated from undergraduate, I gifted myself a working line German Shepherd puppy. I really was drawn to agility, and so I wanted to get her into that. And of course, working line Shepherd can be a challenging pup. So I had to start getting better as a trainer to meet her needs. And the more I got into training and working with some really great trainers in California, I've praised her before, but she is really fantastic. Catherine Horn was our agility instructor. She's the one that got me into clicker training and really having a positive relationship with our animals. And so eventually, I hate stopping things without finishing them, but I finally realized that degree program at Berkeley was not what was really my passion. And so I was lucky enough to get a job at Peninsula Humane Society in the behavior department in San Mateo, California. And I just really loved working in a shelter and trying to help animals. So then I went and got my CPDT, my certification for professional dog training, attended the San Francisco SPCA Dog Trainer Academy. But I always knew I wanted to go back to grad school. So at a Clicker Expo, I met Jesus Rosales Ruiz. And when he said he had a graduate program in this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been looking for. So I went and worked with him, and I just fell in love with the field of behavior analysis. By then, Clive Wynn had opened up his dog lab at University of Florida, and I was able to go there and finish my doctorate. So it's kind of long and windy, but it's always been animal oriented.
I love that. Every time I talk to somebody in this field, it's interesting. There are a lot of parallels. Like we all have so much in common. Like there were some things that you said that I really related to. Like my parents were also very good about allowing me to have a lot of animals in my life and taking me to places where I could experience that. Even though it wasn't really their passion, they supported my passion. And I also went to UC Berkeley.
Oh, nice.
I studied, as an undergrad, I was 17 when I went into UC Berkeley, and I was just overwhelmed. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I ended up taking time off, actually. And then I finished up at UC Davis, but my degree was in zoology because I just knew animals, tried veterinary stuff for a little while and was just like, this isn't quite hitting the mark for me. But I knew I wanted to work with animals, went to a zoo, and my first zoo job. And that's where I was introduced to training. And I went, training, that's it, and then I just continued training in the zoological field. But then, that's where I got introduced more to the behavior analytics side of stuff. But didn't go on to further education at that point, but in terms of academic stuff. But yeah, so it's interesting how a lot of us, we kind of end up at the same point somehow, but through some parallels and then a few little off different tangents, but very fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm hoping as our field gets better, as being a presence on college campuses, like having these companion animal courses, that students will see that there's this opportunity. I think when you and I were in school, it was like, there wasn't, right? You just lucked into it and found out, that way that this was your passion.
Absolutely. I think, Moorpark College was around back then, but I found out about it after the fact, after I'd already graduated and I was already working in zoos. And I was like, I couldn't rationalize going back at that point for something that I was already doing, if that made sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. Wow. Very interesting. So, let's see. One of the things that some people who are listening to this may not know about behavior analysis. So I thought it might be helpful if you maybe described what behavior analysis is, and you also got your board certification. So maybe it would be helpful for people to know what that means exactly.
Sounds good. Yeah. So the field of behavior analysis is a field in psychology. I think it's the best field in psychology. It's based on Skinner. It is really interested in learning and the environmental factors that affect behavior. So it's a really great natural science where we want to have observable, measurable behaviors that we're studying and factors that are affecting them. So we're looking at how delivering reinforcers or punishers, different consequences affect behavior, and how do things that come before the behavior affect them, whether you're in a social setting or if there's a dog next to your dog or a rabbit running by, how are all those things affecting your animal's behavior? And then we have kind of three prongs to behavior analysis. One is behaviorism, which is the philosophy underpinning it. Then we have the experimental analysis of behavior, which is really looking at trying to identify basic principles and their parameters that affect those different principles. And then we have applied behavior analysis, which is taking those basic principles and applying them in applied settings. And getting to work with animals and trying to improve their behavior. We draw on all those basic principles and apply them in working settings, just like you do, to try and help animals learn new, more appropriate behaviors, interact better and more effectively with humans and with others of their own species. So a lot of it is, I just really love the field because I get to be a basic scientist, and then I also get to take what I learn and turn around and apply it in real life settings and hopefully improve how we train and how we understand animal behavior.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate that you talked about those three different sort of divisions or areas, so to speak, because I think so many of us that are out there in the field as trainers, we're in the applied settings, but because we don't have so much exposure maybe to the scientific community where they're able to isolate those dependent variables and independent variables, we don't necessarily we have some difficulties maybe interpreting what's going on sometimes. And so that's why it's really important to have people who are working in the lab who can help us explain why things are happening the way they are. Because sometimes I think we get some interpretations that might be happening in the applied situation that might be a little, I don't know, how do we describe that? We get a little confused.
Right, they're kind of these sort of looser, fluffier explanations sometimes. And a lot of what I love to do is like take it back to basic principles and say, you think that your horse is thinking about something. We don't know what he's thinking about, but we do know that you're applying a punisher here and a reinforcer there, and that's driving his behavior. So I'm with you. I like to bring it back to just the simplest explanation we can find and the most effective explanation for that behavior.
Yeah. And I have to say, I'm going to bring up one of the papers that you published, which I thought was really fantastic, which was about basically the history of dogs in research in psychology. And I think that was just kind of a great example of some of those things, because the one that was jumping out to me was when you were talking about this, was a friend of Darwin's who basically taught the dog to pick up a card that said food if it wanted food, basically. And it was just basically a simple discrimination task, right? And here we are talking 1800s, and we still have people today who are convinced they are teaching animals to read.
I know, exactly. The issues with pop psychology haven't changed. So
I know. And how many people have done this basic, simple discrimination, but refuse to see it as a discrimination.
Right. Exactly. And one of the things I really like is trying to take human behavior that we oftentimes elevate to some weird status of being very special, and instead showing that it's just basic principles, just like the pigeon or the rat or your dog, and that it's, maybe many principles coming together in a complex way, but we're not that special, right? We're very much like our animals.
Yep, exactly. And so that's a really good read if and you have that actually on your website. So we'll have to make sure we give people a link to that because it's a really fascinating read. Actually, I'll let you explain it a little bit more because you're much more closer to it than I am. Tell people about that article that you wrote.
Yeah, so we were, I was actually in Clive's history of psychology class, and we had to kind of look at our background and our academic background and started diving into that and started writing a little bit about the history of dogs as subjects in these sort of psychological and behavioral experiments. We kind of think of our field beginning in like 1998 when, there's some papers coming out on dogs following human gestures. And I do think that's kind of a turning point where we start asking questions about dogs because they are dogs, whereas before it turns out there's a ton of research on dogs. And so I think we ought to mine that as researchers, really go back and see what did they learn that we can draw on rather than assuming we just created this new field. But it was not ever presented that way as dog research. It was research on reflexes or research on discrimination learning using dogs because at that point they were a convenient species. But as dog researchers, people interested in dog behavior, we can still go back to those and learn a lot about some of these experiments they did. Some of these things we just wouldn't be able to replicate. So they would have some of these dog breeding facilities like Scott and Fuller and another group that just had hundreds of dogs that they were carefully breeding and studying their behavior of these mixes. We just don't have the resources to do this multi-generational study now. So trying to capitalize on that, I think, is a great way to go.
And there's like seminal studies that came out of that we still use that information today, like that, terms have been defined based on those studies that we, like the critical periods of development and learned helplessness and all that came out of those studies.
Yeah. It's really amazing to think that some of our, like you said, some of our foundational ideas in psychology were found or identified with research using dogs.
Amazing. So I really highly recommend people check out that article because you will go, whoa, this is like stuff I talk about all the time. And, it came out of this.
Right. Yeah. It was fun to write and fun to research for sure.
Since we kind of got into this topic now about some of the things that you've written, tell me more about this study about dogs' preferences for reinforcers.
Yeah. So I kind of have a general, I have two kind of questions that I'm always interested in is one, can we find effective reinforcers for our dogs so we can be better trainers? And knowing that still to this day, right, we have people that balk at using food, and yet our research suggests it's highly effective. Trying to find, what do dogs like about us? So what can we use as reinforcers? And also, why are dogs social with us? And, why would they hang out with us? And I think that can be turned around into, if we can understand what they like, we can deliver more of that. We can now say that, okay, you like petting, your vocal, my vocal praise doesn't really matter to you. So we gave them just a really simple setup. I think this is one of the fun things about our research is it's really simple. We don't need, $50,000 machines. We set up in the dog's house or in a lab room and look at what they do. So we give the dogs a choice. We have two people sitting there and one person gives one interaction and the other person gives another interaction. So in one study, we looked at petting versus vocal praise. And I think this is the one that always sort of surprises people the most, sort of our average owners. So one person gave petting, the other person would give vocal praise. We actually had 10-minute sessions, and after 5 minutes, they switched. So the person that was giving vocal praise gave petting, the person giving petting gave vocal praise. And we just measured how much time did the dog spend in proximity. We had a little perimeter drawn around the chair where the person was sitting. And we just measured how much time does the dog spend with each of these alternatives. And we found that they very much strongly preferred petting to vocal praise. And even when the people switched interactions, the dog tracked their favorite interaction. So they would leave the person they had been enjoying spending time with and look for other interactions. So when the person, sorry, I'll go back. What we found was that they really preferred petting. And when that petting person switched to vocal praise, the dog would leave their proximity and start looking around the room for other alternatives, because vocal praise turns out is not very meaningful to them. And they would encounter that the other person is now giving petting and spend all their time with the petting person. So we replicated that in own dogs and shelter dogs, and it's been just a really strong effect that they really like petting, but vocal praise is essentially meaningless to them. We did a follow-up experiment where dogs were given just vocal praise, so they only had one alternative. And then in another session, they were being ignored, so the owner was ignoring them. And we alternated these sessions so the dog had exposure to each of those a few times. What we found is that the dog would spend as much time near the owner when they're giving vocal praise as they would when the owner was ignoring them. So the vocal praise was really not doing much. And I always think that's useful to think about how much of our interaction is driven by us and by what we want and what we think they want versus what do they really want.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And I will say, also for me, as someone that's worked a lot in the bird community, especially with companion parrots, you will often hear people talking about using soothing voices, or, what if I give a soothing, talk to him soothingly, if I can just sit next to him and talk to him, won't that help? And having to try to explain in my experience, and again, this would be an interesting one to test. Have to think a lot about how to set up the experiment. Of course, you would know more about how to do that. I find that with parrots, it can create high levels of arousal in some individuals, which can actually easily put them in a situation where they might be triggered to present aggressive behavior. And so I generally tell people not to talk to parrots if they're trying to accomplish something, that they need a calm and relaxed parrot. So that's really interesting that you got those results.
Yeah, and I think that's fun about the parrots, and that, it can actually create arousal. And what's funny, of course, is that I will always have people, including other researchers, say, my dog loves it when I talk to them. And of course, I get a lot of lay folks that will tell me that as well. And usually what happens is we say our dog's a good dog, and then pick up the leash or pet them or give a treat. And so that initial talking to, you see like, some arousal in them, like what's going to happen next. And then if you only praise them, which is what we did in this experiment, we had it nicely controlled, only gave vocal praise, then the dog is like, I've got better things to do with my time if you're just going to be talking at me.
Right. There's no association with some desired consequence.
Exactly. And I think this is where science really comes in, is that it can isolate those things. People have the impression their dog likes to be talked to, but it turns out they get excited when you're talking to them only because it predicts this other better thing that they actually really like. So I think that's always useful to actually isolate those variables, which we don't do in everyday interactions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I love it. Ooh, so exciting. See, this is why science is exciting.
It is. And sometimes it's great because it verifies what you thought you knew. You're like, I was right. My impression was right. And then sometimes, you find things that are surprising, and that's fun too. So I think it's either way, it's a good outcome.
So have there been some research projects that you've done where you did get surprising answers?
I did think that we did a study looking at social interaction and food as reinforcers for dogs. And in that setup, we didn't find much effective social interaction as a reinforcer. And that was a little surprising. I thought that maybe we would see some effect of that, not as effective as food as a reinforcer, but some. There it almost looked like extinction. We've been doing some follow-up research, and it does seem that my guess is that social interaction is a reinforcer for dogs, but they satiate on it potentially quickly, at least more quickly than food. And so if you spread it out during the day, which is what we normally do anyway, which is, give her social reinforcer here, and then I get to take you on a walk and give you food and then praise you and pet you later on, that sort of spacing out might maintain its value as a reinforcer. But when we ask the dog to do repetitive behaviors, touch and touch and touch and touch, that for social interaction, we saw that the rate of reinforcement or the rate of responding decreased, like I said, almost looking like extinction, where they had initially some responding, but with persistent trials, it decreased.
Yeah, I could see that. I'm just imagining myself. I'm working on a behavior right now, and I'm thinking if I were to try and shape this behavior using a social reinforcer versus using food with my individual animal, who I obviously know well, I do not imagine that petting or some sort of social interaction would be as successful with this animal, at least, compared to using bits of chicken, which is what I use.
Exactly. Yeah. And we did find one little pit bull cross that did work as hard for social as she did for food, but she was a real standout. And like you said, there's a lot of individual differences. And I think with our food delivery, it's so quick. It's highly effective as a reinforcer. We get lots of training opportunities and repetition. So I'm with you. I think I would love for someone to try shaping with just social interaction and see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, it would be great to take a big pool of individuals and kind of get sort of a general trend and compare and contrast that. And you're right. There might be some individuals that stand out, but I have a feeling too that you probably get, at least with dogs in general, who are getting an average normal diet, and you pick a preferred food item that you'd probably see the trend of food is the easiest thing to work with.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's been more research into horses on this too. And the same thing comes up, that food is more effective than petting or grooming or some of the other interactions.
Oh, I hate to interrupt this great interview, but I've got to give you your secret word. The first secret word is petting, Petting. Secret words are important to remember and submit if you're a member of animaltrainingfundamentals.com and you are working towards badges for professional development. Some of our podcasts are required for certain badges. All right, let's get back to the program. Why do you think research is important for addressing our questions about animal welfare and how we live and work with our companion animals?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that it can answer some of those really sort of questions that, like I said, we can't necessarily gather information from just from our observations. Like we might get a hunch, but until we really isolate those variables and say, I'm just going to look at vocal praise and I'm just going to look at petting, rather than, well, this person gave vocal praise for 3 seconds, then picked up the leash and went on a walk. We can really start to see what those effects are. And then we can come back and say, how can we be better for our animals then? If I know that you really love food or you are very motivated by play, but you're not motivated by petting or praise, then I can be a better trainer. And really, I think I was talking to someone the other day about research and being a good trainer and behaviorist. I think those are really the same things, where you go in there and you're having to pick out, what do I think are the environmental variables that are impacting this behavior that I've been called to solve? Like, is it the presence of the owner? Is it being in a weird situation? Is it being approached by a stranger? And so we're really kind of, I think, in our applied world, researchers already of trying to figure out what are the variables that are impacting this behavior and how can I change that? Of course, our science just makes it a little bit bigger, formalizes it, make sure we can demonstrate experimental control that we might not get in a single case. But I think we can start to kind of get some objective views on what is good training, what is good welfare for animals, rather than leaving it to subjective views on this.
Yeah. And there is so much, I mean, everybody has, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but I think most people have good intentions. We're all trying to do what we think is best for animals. But I think you're right. The challenge is you're right. It's kind of being left up to opinion, but I guess the research really does help take that subjective part out of it and put it into data.
Right. And I think, people are coming up with some unique ways of trying to assess these things. Recently, the cognitive bias or judgment bias tests, I think, are an interesting way to try and assess affect in animals, which can be hard to measure, right? We think we know what a happy dog looks like, but are there ways to quantify that? Can we show that, the tail up and wagging and the ears forward and kind of a loose body correlate with some of these other measures that we might think of as being positive indicators of well-being? I think that's one of our challenges, is that we think we know what a stressed animal looks like based on our experiences, but it'd be great to correlate that with maybe physiological measures that say, yes, when the dog is lip licking and the ears are back and the tail is tucked, we see maybe increased adrenal activity or increased cortisol, things like that, to really kind of hone in on that our observations are correct. And if they're not, what we need to refine about them. And maybe we find that there are some behaviors that are really hard to see, but they're actually really predictive of being stressed. And maybe some of our other factors or other behaviors don't line up that way. I imagine they will, but I think just sort of verifying that for ourselves is important to move forward as a science and as an evidence-based field.
I am so down for that, especially what you just said right there, because, and again, this is, and maybe this is how a lot of research does get started. We have our moments when we're observing animals and we start questioning things. And I personally have been having some of those moments with my own dog where I'm just watching his behavior, and what we've been told, just as animal trainers, you get, your information that comes into you, and people say, when the animal's doing this, it means that. And I'm in conflict. There's some things my dog does, and he does it at a certain time when everything about him is relaxed and calm. And I've had somebody say, oh, your dog, did this, he's stressed. And I'm like, I don't think he's stressed. There's nothing about him that's stressed right now. I know everything going on in his environment. I know, like, he just, rolled out of bed and did this, and I don't think he's stressed. And you're telling me he's stressed because he did this. And I'm like, that doesn't match up. And so for me, I would love that if we had physiological data to go with that. And then we started looking, and again, I always go back to with body language. We know there's only so much that can happen, with what you can physically do with your body. Right. And so, it may mean one thing under this context and another thing under this context, and so on and so forth. So I love the idea of adding some physiological measures. And so we're not just taking for granted what a bunch of people said and started agreeing with, because we know that can change over time.
Exactly. And I'll just say, if you want to talk to somebody about that, Dr. Lisa Gunter did her dissertation looking at that with shelter dogs. So she'd be great. And then the one that comes to mind with that is in the horse world, they'll say that the horse licking and chewing means it's thinking about what it just learned and it's being submissive, like really weird interpretations, right? It's like, how do you know that your horse is thinking about what it just learned? Or how do you know it's being submissive, rather than, is there another reason for that? And then when science comes in and says, well, look at this, it happens every time we apply a stressor or an aversive stimulus and remove it, we get licking and lip licking and chewing. And so maybe it's not that the horse is thinking about what it just learned or is showing you submission. It's just, a response to the removal of a stressor. And that kind of changes, right? That changes our view of that. And maybe, hopefully, that changes how we train if we recognize that as now, that's an indication that I had applied a stressor, rather than my horse is just thinking about what he learned. And maybe I need to change my way of training if I'm applying a lot of these stressors to him.
You're right. You just reminded me of another one I'd heard about horses too, that a certain ear position was concentration.
I know.
There's a lot of them out there, huh?
There's a lot of stuff to dive through, I know. And I think as much as our dog world has leaps and bounds to go, there's some that are really progressive and some that are behind. I think the equine world is even further behind, unfortunately, and they're coming along, which is great. But I think there's so much training lore out there that can really interfere with us being good trainers and being good handlers and good owners.
Yeah. Oh, you got me thinking about so many things now. This is really cool. All right. So now I've got another one that I just want to ask about, because as I was reading some of the things there, this popped up at me. So we hear about studies about cognition versus studying behavior, and then also behavior analysis. So is there a difference? What is cognition?
So, I mean, in the psychology world, folks will delineate that. I think as a radical behaviorist, we would say there is no difference, that cognition is just complex behavior. And I think Clive Wynne and Monique Udell in their book take a view that cognition is the whole scope of behavior that an animal can engage in. And so that's kind of the view I take, that cognition is not different. It is just complex behavior, and it is likely impacted by those same variables, those same antecedent variables, and those same consequences of reinforcement and punishment. And what I think would be really great, and I think, you know, some folks are doing, like Monique, is taking these sort of fancier terms like social cognition of the dog and bringing them back down to basic principles that, yes, the dog hasn't evolved to be have special social cognition to follow human gestures. It is a learned behavior. It's a reinforced behavior. And turns out all these animals can do it, right? And I just saw, I think Clive had posted a story about kangaroos being able to follow human gestures. And so, you know, it's not unique to domesticated animals. It is, you know, it's just a reinforced behavior and a discrimination.
Wow. Wow. God, yeah. I think it must be because, you know, we have this, you know, this history of evolving with dogs and this relationship with dogs, or dogs evolving with us, that, you know, we just want to apply all this magic to them, huh?
I know. I mentioned that we have our new masters, and I was reading some of my students' responses to one of our questions, and one of them mentioned that, like, because we were talking about Dr. Udell and Dr. Wynn's studies about social cognition, and she had the same comment, like, I wonder if it's because we interact with them so much, and we do tend to assume that, you know, we project so much onto them that we really kind of elevate their behavior and make it sort of special and magical beyond, you know, normal behavioral principles. But we do that with ourselves too. You know, like I said before, we just think that we're special, and we don't recognize how much these basic principles go into and control our own behavior. And I always like this. Skinner and Epstein did some great experiments called the Columban experiments, where they looked at insight and self-concept in the pigeon, communication, like chatting in the pigeon, and they broke it down to these really lovely basic principles, showed how you could train each component. You put it together and you get pigeons having a conversation, or you get pigeons that look like they have self-concept or insight. And so what they were great about was saying insight is a product of reinforcement, and, you know, all of these things. And so it takes our, what we think are fancy and you know, above behavioral principles behaviors back down to, no, they are products of complex arrangements of those principles. And I think that's really, really useful. And I just love that they use pigeons, because I think if they had used dogs, people would say they'd be more inclined to stick with the insight view. But it's hard to say, oh, that pigeon has insight, or that pigeon has a self-concept. It's harder for people to make that leap. And then I think it makes it easier for them to say, well, maybe that's the same as me, right? Maybe my self-concept is just a product of reinforcement.
Oh my God. Oh, now everybody also has to read Beyond Freedom and Dignity too, especially now, right now during COVID times. Oh, okay. I have some digging to do because I want to read about the pigeons and the self-concept and the
Yeah.
conversations and everything.
If you go on YouTube, Dr. Epstein has posted a lot of the videos and talked about them. So you can find some of the Columban, if you look up Columban Simulation, you'll find a lot of those videos on there, which is, it's just great to have to see it. It's even better than reading a paper.
I think what I'll have to do is attach those videos to this podcast episode. And so that people can look at those videos after they listen to you speak. I think that'll be very inspiring.
Excellent.
I love this. Oh my gosh. We're going down all sorts of tangents here. This is awesome. Thanks.
This is something when you get on with another behavior nerd, right? Is like
exactly. We get all excited about these things. Oh, and you had me thinking about something there when you were talking about the pigeons and the insights, and now I forgot what it was, but I was going on another track. Oh, I know what it was. The applying these special skill sets or whatever, or insights with these animals. But I think people have done that with the parrots too, because again, because parrots form these really strong pair bonds in the wild, or at least certain species of parrots do. And if they are raised by people, they'll do that with an individual in the household. So you'll get these parrots that are like, I want to spend every living moment with you. If you get separated from you, I'm going to scream my head off. And I love you, and I'll preen your eyebrows and your eyelashes, and I'll bite the heck out of everybody else. And so, you get this like, this bird loves me, hates everybody else. It's such a smart bird. And then, you get parrots that can talk and mimic human speech, and they seem to do it at the right time. But of course, it's because of reinforcement history. And so then you get, Alex, the African gray parrot that, again, to me, discriminations, but, nobody wants to believe that, because that's, that would be dumbing it down. But, so again, there was this whole thing about, elevating birds to, in a weird way. If I don't want to like devalue birds, because I think obviously parrots are amazing, but I love to think of, they're amazing as birds. We don't have to make them little humans. And yes, they do respond to all the laws of all the learning processes, just as we do, like you just described there. But yeah, it just changes the way, or why people have this need to be like, it's a 5-year-old child, or it thinks just like a 2-year-old child. And it's like, but it can do things you can't do. So why not be amazed by that?
Right. I completely agree. And I can see where anytime any animal has a semblance of language, whether it's true language or, just sort of the mimicry with that, you're going to run in, it's going to be even harder to get them to think about this in other ways. But I'm entirely with you of these animals are amazing. We don't have to say they have insight, and by saying they don't have insight doesn't make them any less amazing. We'll just be better at appreciating them for what they are and responding better to them if we actually understand them and not give them things that they don't do. And also recognizing that our insight is likely not that special either, and just a product of reinforcement.
Yeah. And again, think about the amazing things dogs do that we can't do,
Exactly. Yeah. I remember there was I can't remember who said this. Every species is as smart as it needs to be.
Yep.
And they're all smart in different ways. So it's hard to compare. Any of those rankings really annoy me. Rankings of breeds, or rankings of animal species in terms of intelligence. It's I go back to E.G. Boring was a American psychologist, and he said, intelligence is whatever intelligence tests measure. That's it. However you define it, that'll be intelligence.
Yeah, because I used to always get asked, what's the most intelligent species you've ever worked with? And I would always say, well, they're all as intelligent as they need to be to survive in the environment, or they're adapted to survive in the environment that they need to. Because when you think about, like, people always say, like owls are quote not very intelligent, but they're just so adapted to be very successful in the environment in which they live. And so again, there's an animal that can do things I could never do, with, depending on the species it is, maybe incredible vision at night and hearing at night, and fly silently and be able to respond to something that I could never detect. And catch, a mouse in the middle of, blackness silently. Right. I can't do any of that. I can't even barely see, 10 feet in front of me at night nowadays.
Exactly. So if we measured that as intelligence, right, the owl would certainly win over both of us.
Right. Yeah. And its ability to detect certain stimuli and respond to it that I can't do.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm getting off on a weird tangent here. Okay. Sorry, guys, going to interrupt another time to give you your second secret word. And the secret word is history. 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 All right, let's get back to the program. Let me see. All right. So what about like if somebody wanted to get into a field where maybe they were researching this kind of stuff? I know we both, we were saying that your trajectory wasn't maybe traditional, but what would you recommend for somebody, or what kind of person does it take to want to learn and do this kind of stuff and maybe research?
As you're saying, I think for our trajectories, it was harder to find this field, and we really had to kind of dive into it. And it wasn't showing up on the radar in academia. And now it is. There are a number of dog labs and other folks that are studying domestic animal behavior and how to improve our interactions with them. So I would certainly, encourage folks to, if they have the opportunity, for younger folks that are going into undergraduate, to try and find fields like that, programs that might have somebody that's teaching sort of domestic animal or behavior analytic animal behavior courses. And try and get involved in research there. I know many of our wonderful trainers already have their undergraduate degree or aren't in a position to go get one. So I think trying to learn from folks that are in that field at seminars and pick it up that way. If they do have the opportunity, like I said, for folks that are in a position where they're getting their undergraduate degree, getting involved in research, I really think for us, what I really love is kind of two prongs. One is becoming a good researcher, and one is being involved in the system, being a practitioner, and so that what are the meaningful questions to our practitioners right now. There are so many questions we could ask, but I think understanding what are the problems that they're having, what behavioral issues are challenging to solve, what are some techniques that maybe we need to really delve into and see what's driving this? Is it effective? And if so, why is it effective? So I think I always encourage people to get research experience and applied experience to really see both ends of that. I think research is kind of a weird field in that, I always did really well in school, and I could do well on standardized tests and all of that. That doesn't always translate to being a good researcher. You really have to be okay with not knowing things and being wrong about things. And for some of us that were like, I'm going to get everything right on this exam, that can be a challenge to kind of release that and say, I'm going to be wrong. I'm going to mess things up in my experiment and I'll have to redo it. Things won't work and I'll have to try again. I won't get results that I thought I was going to get. I'm going to have to reshape my view of my system. So I think having that, if you are going to go into research as a researcher, you really have to kind of have that sense that it's just going to be fun. We're going to find things we didn't think. Things that we wanted to work aren't going to work. And having that flexibility. There was, I'll have to find it. There was a paper, I think it was in either Nature or Science. It was kind of a letter, and it was said something about the utility of being stupid in science. And it was essentially saying, releasing control a little bit and saying, there are so many things I don't know. And I'm going to go into this knowing I don't know things, and then I'm going to be wrong about things, is really, useful to being a good researcher.
Ooh, this is all really helpful information. I used to work in labs when I was in college and undergrad, and I would work as a work study student. And that's how I paid my way through school. And I worked in behavior labs, and I worked in a evolutionary biology lab. And I remember saying to the professors that I worked for that I always just liked having somebody tell me the answer. I didn't like having to go through the process of figuring it out. And now you're making me feel quite empathetic towards them. and what they went through. But they were pretty amazing, accomplished academics and what they did. And all I did is I raised crickets to feed the lizards and the salamanders but yeah, now I'm trying to think of all the things that they must have gone through so many times over.
I know we joke, Lisa Gunter and I and some others had worked on our shelter welfare project, looking at sending dogs on short fosters, like sleepovers, and its effect on cortisol. And we were joking that we worked with 5 different shelters. We were at each shelter for about a month. That and each dog we collected, except for one shelter, dogs had 6 cortisol samples collected, so 6 urinary samples collected on each dog. And I said, and in the paper it's going to show up with one line, we collected urine from X number of dogs. I was like, it does not reflect the challenges, like the tears and heartache and the, trying to squeeze every last drop of urine out to make sure we had enough for analysis, and, making sure that the shelters were on board with what we're doing and working and getting the shelters engaged and making sure that our program was going to fit in what they were doing. None of that gets put in there, right? It just one sentence, we collected urine.
But even saying we collected urine doesn't sound all that pleasant in general.
We used to joke that we should get team t-shirts that had splashes of yellow on them.
as a conversation starter. Ask me about these yellow spots.
Exactly.
So are there ways that people who are training animals out in the field, are there ways that they can get involved in any projects, or is it really something that's much more controlled than that?
No, I think I would love to have that. I think, we have so many fantastic trainers out there that are really scientifically savvy and want to contribute. And it does feel daunting, not to be in a lab to contribute, but I think we can. We had worked with the Academy for Dog Trainers, and they helped us recruit folks that would run some of our experiments looking at reinforcer efficacy with their dogs. And so I think that would be a way I would love to see our field develop, is tapping into their knowledge, their ability to follow training protocols really well, their ability to measure and monitor behavior, and really expand our knowledge base by utilizing that, because I think, they're just an untapped resource. They have access to all these animals. They're really savvy. They're good trainers. And so if we could try and capitalize on that, I think that would be great. So we're trying a little bit, and hopefully, I sort of hope that we can develop this, further as we go.
Well, this has been super fun. I think I've laughed more on this one than I have on many of them. I don't know. We got goofy. But if people wanted to learn more about what you're doing and the university and all your teachings and maybe some of your articles, where should they go to find you?
So at Virginia Tech, you can find me at apsc.vt.edu. So that's APSC, like animal and poultry science.vt.edu. And you can find me on the faculty webpage. I also have my own webpage, Erica N. Feuerbacher. So you just have to spell my last name. So Erica N as in Nancy, Feuerbacher.com. And as you mentioned, I have some of my papers on there too. If there are papers that aren't on there, they're welcome to email me and I can send copies.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure that all those links are available on the episode webpage. So thank you so much, Dr. Erica. This is great.
Thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun.
Wasn't that a super fun interview? I told you it was a good one. And of course, absolutely incredibly educational. I love the studies about reinforcer preferences and what we want to use for shaping procedures. And of course, the history of dog training. I tell you, that article was really, really good. I really enjoyed reading that, and I highly recommend you check that out. It's super user-friendly. You're not going to have a problem reading it whatsoever. And I love the conversation about body language, because I think a lot of us are mostly going off of, our kind of our intuition there, I guess, for lack of a better word, and we're just passing it on to to the next person and the next trainer. And I love the idea of taking some physiological readings to see if it matches up with what we think we're seeing. I think that's really great information. And then, of course, I think the overall message is really measuring what we see empirically and studying it. And I think Dr. Erica is really good about talking about all of this in a really user-friendly way, and I hope you all appreciated that in our conversation. I think she really made all of that very accessible for everybody and really easy to understand, and really gives that perspective on behavior that's really, really helpful and shows you that it is a science, and that when we look at it from that perspective, we get a very different understanding of behavior than I think a lot of us have when we just kind of look at it from our layman's perspective. And it's really helpful to really give you a different understanding of behavior. And that's what I really appreciate about having a conversation with a behavior analyst. And I hope you got that today in this particular episode. So I want to thank Dr. Erica again for such a fabulous conversation. I really appreciated talking to her, and I hope I get to talk to her again. All right, that's it for today. Talk to you guys later. Hey, do you like this podcast? I certainly hope so. It's free, awesome content about the coolest topics in the world, like animals, training, behavior, science, and the experts in these fields. The good thing about this podcast is the more this information is shared, the more animals benefit. The way you can help get this podcast to more people is by rating and reviewing it. A good review helps get it featured on searches. And guess what? Your good behavior gets noticed around here. We'll randomly pick a winner from all the reviews given to receive a free 1-year membership to the online education program, animaltrainingfundamentals.com. And if you all are super participatory and do a lot of reviews, we will do this as often as 4 times a year. But if we don't get too many, maybe it's just a 2 times a year thing. We'll have to see how it goes. If you're not sure how to give a review, just go to animaltrainingfundamentals.com/podcast and look for the big green button for instructions. If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our force-free family.